strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, had many friends. None was closer than Mr. Richard Enfield, the well-known man about town. Each Sunday they went walking together. One of these rambles led them by chance down a side street in a busy part of London. The street was filled with bright shops, the shutters freshly painted, brasses well polished. 2 doors from the corner, however, the line of shops was broken by the entry to a courtyard. At that point, a sinister building thrust a dark gable to the street. Its windows were blank, the door dirty and neglected. Mr. Enfield lifted his cane and pointed.
"Did you ever notice that door?"
he asked.
"It reminds me of a very strange story."
"Indeed?"
said Mr. Utterson keenly.
"And what was that?"
"I was passing this way one black winter's night,"
Mr. Enfield said.
"Every street was empty, for most folks were asleep. All at once I saw 2 figures. One was a small man stumping along, the other a little girl running down a cross street. The 2 ran into one another at the corner, and the little girl fell down heavily. Then came the horrible part. The man kicked her body aside and left her screaming on the ground."
He frowned at the memory.
"I was so angry that I ran after him and made him come back."
"Go on," said Mr. Utterson.
The man was quite cool, but he gave me one look so black and ugly that I broke into a sweat. By this time people had gathered, and the little girl's family had appeared. She had been sent out earlier to fetch a doctor, and he too arrived on the scene. The little girl was more frightened than hurt,"
he went on.
"You might have thought that would have been the end of it, although we were rightly angry over what the fellow had done. But something about him aroused strange feelings in everyone there. Both the doctor and I hated him at first sight. Some of the others were so angry we had to hold them back. I can't explain it."
"It's very curious,"
said Mr. Utterson thoughtfully.
"Yes, it is,"
agreed Mr. Enfield.
"Anyway, we told the fellow we would make a fuss all over London over what he'd done. He didn't want that, and agreed to pay £100 to the little girl's family to prevent it."
Mr. Enfield pointed with his cane.
"He went through that door to get it." "That isn't all,"
Mr. Enfield went on.
"He came back with some cash and a cheque. The cheque was signed by a man well known throughout London for his good works. We thought it must be a forgery, but the fellow insisted on staying with me at my rooms until the bank opened. The cheque was genuine."
"How strange,"
Mr. Utterson murmured.
"It's a bad story."
Mr. Enfield sighed.
"The man isn't easy to describe, although I can see him still. There was something wrong with his appearance. He looked odd, as if he were deformed in some way. Yet that does not explain why I hated him so. Also, I still wonder about the man who signed the cheque. I won't tell you his name, for he is so well known. Why did he provide the money to such a man? Could it be blackmail over some secret from his past? It's a real mystery."
"Who was the man who knocked over the child?"
asked Mr. Utterson suddenly.
"He is called Hyde. Edward Hyde."
When he heard the name, Mr. Utterson frowned and stared at the neglected door.
"You don't have to tell me who wrote the cheque,"
he said with a sigh.
"I think I know already, for this is the back door to Henry Jekyll's laboratory. It's best that we say no more about this, my friend."
After dinner that evening, Mr. Utterson took a lamp into his study. Opening the safe, he took out a document marked Dr. Jekyll's Will. He studied it, his face serious. Dr. Jekyll was one of his oldest friends. Mr. Utterson had advised him not to make this will, but he had insisted. Here it was, in black and white. On the death of Henry Jekyll, all his possessions were to go to his friend, Edward Hyde. That was not all. If Dr. Jekyll were to disappear for more than 3 months, Edward Hyde was to step into his shoes without any further delay. The will had baffled and worried Mr. Utterson, for at the time he'd never heard of this Mr. Hyde. Now that Richard Enfield had told him his story, he was even more concerned.
I thought it was madness at the time,
he said to himself, putting the will away.
Now I'm afraid there may be disgrace here, too. I must talk to Dr. Lanyon.
Putting on his coat, he set out for Cavendish Square, where the great Dr. Lanyon had his home and saw his many patients. Lanyon himself welcomed him in. After a little talk, Mr. Utterson led up to the subject which worried him.
We must be Henry Jekyll's oldest friends,
he said. I suppose we are, agreed Dr. Lanyon. I see little of him nowadays, however.
Indeed.
The lawyer was surprised.
I thought you had a great deal in common.
We had. The doctor's face grew angry suddenly. But some time ago, Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He's gone wrong in his mind. His ideas are unscientific rubbish.
Have you come across a friend of his? A man called Hyde?
Mr. Utterson asked. Hyde? No, never heard of him. Dr. Lanyon could tell Mr. Utterson no more, and the lawyer returned home. All night he tossed and turned, worrying about Dr. Jekyll and his link with the mysterious Mr. Hyde. A strong desire to see the fellow's face grew in the lawyer's mind. Perhaps if he saw him, he might begin to understand why Jekyll had made such a strange will. At least it would be a face worth seeing. The face which had aroused such powerful dislike in Richard Enfield's calm mind. From then on, as often as he could, Mr. Utterson watched the mysterious laboratory door. At last, his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, frosty night. In spite of the growl of London from all around, the lamplit street was very quiet. Footsteps echoed out and drew near. Mr. Utterson held his breath as a small man appeared from the shadows and made for the door. He took a key from his pocket, like someone coming home. Mr. Utterson stepped forward.
Mr. Hyde, I believe.
That is my name. The man drew in a hissing breath. What do you want?
I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard of me. I see you're going in. Will you let me in too?
Dr. Jekyll is not at home, growled Mr. Hyde, not looking up.
Will you show me your face?
Asked the lawyer so suddenly that Hyde started. He hesitated, then turned. The two men stared at one another. It's as well we met, said Mr. Hyde hoarsely. You should have my address. And he gave the lawyer a number in a Soho street. Then he demanded, How did you know me?
We have friends in common,
Mr. Utterson said.
Jekyll, for instance.
He never told you? Mr. Hyde gave a savage laugh. Turning, he unlocked the door and disappeared inside. Mr. Utterson stood stock still for a moment.
Why did he give me his address?
He asked himself.
Was he thinking of the will?
Mr. Utterson walked slowly away. Mr. Hyde was ugly. His body seemed somehow out of shape, but the lawyer was baffled. The man's looks could not explain why he, like Mr. Enfield, now disliked him so much.
There must be something more. If I could find a name for it,
he said to himself.
The man seems hardly human. My poor Henry Jekyll. If ever I saw the sign of Satan in a face, it was in that of your new friend.
Shaking his head, the lawyer walked slowly round the corner to a quiet square of handsome houses. Stopping at one of them, he knocked at the door. A butler answered.
Is Dr. Jekyll in, Poole?
the lawyer asked.
No, sir, he is out.
I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the laboratory door just now.
Mr. Utterson said.
Is that right, with Dr. Jekyll not here?
Quite right, sir,
replied the butler.
We have orders to obey Mr. Hyde. He has his own key and mostly uses the laboratory door.
I see. Well, good night, fool.
Mr. Utterson set off home, more puzzled than ever. So, Dr. Jekyll allowed Mr. Hyde to come and go as he pleased. Hyde must have some hold on him.
Poor Henry Jekyll,
sighed the lawyer.
I fear he is in trouble. He may even be in danger. If Hyde knows about the will and wants Jekyll's money, who can say what he might do? I must try to help, if Jekyll will let me.
By good luck, Dr. Jekyll invited Mr. Utterson to a dinner party soon afterwards. When the other guests had gone, Mr. Utterson stayed behind, as he often did. The two men sat by the fire talking. The thin, dry lawyer and the well-built, smooth-faced doctor. Mr. Utterson brought up the subject of the will.
I know you don't approve of it,
said the wealthy doctor, a trifle sharply.
Well, I tell you so again,
said the lawyer,
for I have been hearing about Mr. Hyde.
Dr. Jekyll's handsome face grew pale, and his eyes darkened.
I do not care to hear any more,
he told Mr. Utterson.
My position is a strange one. You don't understand. I will tell you one thing. I can be rid of Mr. Hyde any time I choose. This is a private matter, my good Utterson, so please say no more.
Very well,
said the lawyer stiffly, getting to his feet.
I have a very great interest in poor Hyde.
Dr. Jekyll laid his hand on his friend's arm.
If I'm taken away, please see that he gets his rights. Help him for my sake when I'm no longer here.
Mr. Utterson heaved a sigh.
As you wish,
he said.
But I can't pretend I shall ever like him.
Nearly a year later, London was stunned by a vicious crime. The details were startling. A maidservant who lived in a house near the river went to her room late one night. A brilliant moon lit the lane below her window, and for a time she sat on the window seat looking out. As she watched, an elderly, white-haired gentleman approached. He called out a pleasant greeting to another, smaller man who was passing. To her horror, the smaller man seemed to fly into a rage, stamping his foot and waving a heavy cane. Startled, the elderly gentleman took a step back, but the other rushed at him like a madman. In a great flame of anger, he struck out with the cane. He beat the old gentleman again and again, even when his victim lay on the ground, helpless. The attack was so cruel that the maid fainted. As soon as she recovered, she sent for the police. When they arrived, they found the elderly gentleman lying dead. He was none other than the distinguished MP, Sir Danvers Carew. The murderer had gone, but the maid had seen his face in the moonlight and had recognized him.
I know who he is,
she cried.
He is called at my master's house. His name is Edward Hyde.
The police found half a broken cane in the gutter and a letter stamped for posting in the dead man's pocket. It was addressed to Mr. Utterson. Inspector Newcomen of Scotland Yard hastened to call on the lawyer. Mr. Utterson was shocked to hear of Carew's death. He opened the letter the inspector had brought and read it quickly.
This is a business letter from Carew,
he said.
He is a client of mine. You say he was murdered?
Yes, sir.
The inspector's voice was grim.
He was clubbed down by a man called Edward Hyde. We're looking for him now. Have you heard of him?
Mr. Utterson nodded gravely.
I have, Inspector. I can even show you where he lives. Come, we'll take a cab.
Hyde's home lay in a dismal part of Soho. The fellow had lived comfortably, for the house itself was richly furnished. The two men found it deserted. There were signs of a hurried departure. Clothes lay about, drawers stood half open, and papers had been burned in the grate. On the floor lay the other half of the broken cane. Mr. Utterson's heart sank. Broken as it was, he recognized it as one he himself had given, Henry Jekyll. The inspector picked it up.
He's gone, sir,
he said.
but he won't get away. You may depend on it. We'll find him.
Next morning, Mr. Utterson made an urgent call on Henry Jekyll. Poole admitted him and led him across the yard to the building at the rear of the house where Dr. Jekyll had his study and laboratory. Dr. Jekyll was in the study, huddled over the fire. He looked deathly sick.
Have you heard about Sir Danvers Carew?
Demanded Mr. Utterson. The doctor nodded and shuddered.
Carew was my client,
said the lawyer.
but so are you. Hyde killed him, murdered him in a fit of rage. Have you been mad enough to hide the fellow?
Utterson, I swear I'll never see him again.
Cried the doctor.
It is all over. Mark my words, he will never be heard of again.
I hope not.
Said the lawyer grimly.
If it came to a trial, your name might be brought into it.
He hesitated, then asked his friend a question.
Tell me, Jekyll, did Hyde suggest you should leave everything to him in your will?
The doctor nodded slowly.
I knew it,
Cried Mr. Utterson.
He meant to murder you. You had a fine escape.
I've had more, my friend.
Dr. Jekyll buried his face in his hands.
What a lesson I've had.
Time ran on, but the murderer of Sir Danvers Carew was never found. Tales came out of Edward Hyde's past, tales of cruelty and violence, of strange friends, and a wicked way of life. Hatred seemed to have surrounded him. No one had a good word to say about the man. All of London looked for him, but he had disappeared, as if he had never existed. Mr. Utterson's alarm began to fade. Mr. Hyde's influence gone, life returned to normal for Henry Jekyll. He met his friends, worked hard, and did good for many people. For more than 2 months, he was himself. Mr. Utterson was glad. Then, suddenly, Dr. Jekyll shut himself away in his laboratory. Every day for a week, Mr. Utterson called, but his friend refused to see him. Worried, the lawyer called on Dr. Lanyon. Mr. Utterson was shocked at the change in Dr. Lanyon. He'd grown thin and pale, and looked old and tired. Fear lay deep in his eyes, and showed in his manner. "I have had a bad shock, Utterson," he said in a whisper. "I fear I will not recover." Mr. Utterson touched his friend's arm.
Jekyll is ill too,
He observed.
Have you seen him?
To his surprise, Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand. "I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll," he said in a loud, unsteady voice. "I am quite done with him, and regard him as dead. Some day you may understand, Utterson. I cannot speak of it now." Less than 2 weeks later, Dr. Lanyon died. After the funeral, Mr. Utterson sat down at his desk and sadly opened an envelope Dr. Lanyon had left for him. It contained only a second, heavily sealed envelope. On this was written, "Not to be opened till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll." Mr. Utterson gasped. He could not believe what he had just read. Yet again, as in the mad will, the sinister idea of disappearance was linked with the name of Henry Jekyll. In the will, that idea had also been suggested. What could it mean now, coming from Dr. Lanyon? Although he longed to open the envelope, Mr. Utterson kept faith with Dr. Lanyon's wishes. He put the envelope into the innermost corner of his safe. time passed, and Mr. Utterson tried again to see Dr. Jekyll. Poole told him that the doctor seemed to have something on his mind. He spent all his time in the laboratory building, even sleeping there. He refused to see anyone, even the servants. The lawyer's visits became fewer, until they stopped. One Sunday, Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield. Their way led them down the little street of shops. When they reached the laboratory door, they stopped.
I wonder how Jekyll is,
said Mr. Utterson. They stepped back and looked up at the laboratory windows. To their surprise, Dr. Jekyll sat at one of them, looking out sadly. His face was very pale, and Mr. Utterson felt great pity for him.
Jekyll,
he called.
It's a lovely day. Come out for a walk.
Dr. Jekyll shook his head.
I dare not,
he said with a faint smile.
But I'm so glad to see you, Utterson. Stay and talk a while.
The words were hardly out before a look of terror and despair struck the smile from his face. The sudden change froze the blood of the men below. The window was instantly thrust down, and Dr. Jekyll was gone from sight. The two men turned and left without a word. Not until they had reached the next street did they look at one another.
Something is very wrong,
Mr. Utterson said gravely. Sitting by his fireside one evening, Mr. Utterson was surprised to receive a visit from Poole, Dr. Jekyll's butler.
It's Dr. Jekyll, sir,
he said in a low voice.
You know how he has shut himself up in his study? Well, I've been afraid for a week and can bear it no longer. Will you come? I think there's been foul play.
Mr. Utterson jumped to his feet.
Foul play?
He cried.
I'll come at once.
They hurried through the quiet streets to Dr. Jekyll's house and across the yard to the laboratory building. Henry Jekyll was in his study, and the door was locked. Poole knocked.
Mr. Utterson has come to see you, sir,
he called. A voice answered from within.
Tell him I can see no one. Thank you, sir.
Poole put his finger to his lips and led Mr. Utterson silently out into the yard. There he looked the lawyer in the eye.
You heard that voice, Mr. Utterson,
he said.
Did it sound like Dr. Jekyll?
I can't be sure, Poole,
Mr. Utterson said with a worried frown.
That wasn't my master,
Poole insisted.
It's a week since I heard him speak. I'm afraid he has been done away with. But who's in there instead?
Are you saying Dr. Jekyll has been murdered?
Demanded Mr. Utterson.
If he has, his murderer would not stay in there. That doesn't make sense.
Listen, Mr. Utterson,
the butler begged.
All last week, he, or it, or whatever is in that room has been crying out for medicine. Dr. Jekyll sometimes writes his orders on a piece of paper and leaves it for me. That's what I've had all week. Notes to go to a wholesale chemist for some kind of salt. Each time I've brought the salt back, there's been another note to say the stuff wasn't pure, and I've had to go to another chemist for more. The drug is wanted bitter bad, sir.
Mr. Utterson stared anxiously at the butler.
Perhaps it's Dr. Jekyll who wants the drug. He may be ill.
Poole shook his head.
Someone else is in there,
he said.
I came in suddenly today, just in time to see him run from the laboratory into the study. My master is a tall, fine build of a man. This was more like a dwarf, and he was wearing a mask. It wasn't Dr. Jekyll.
Mr. Utterson made up his mind.
Then we must break the door down,
he said firmly,
and see who it is.
Poole fetched a heavy axe, and they crept back to the study door. Inside they could hear footsteps pacing up and down, and the sound of unhappy groans.
Sometimes he weeps like a lost soul,
whispered Poole.
Jekyll, let me in,
called Mr. Utterson loudly.
I cannot,
groaned the voice from within.
Utterson, have mercy.
You're right, Poole,
cried the lawyer.
That's not Jekyll's voice. I recognize it now. It's Hyde's. Down with the door.
The butler swung the heavy axe. The blow shook the whole building, but the lock held. A dismal screech rang out from inside. The axe crashed down again and again. The door was very strong, but at last it gave way and fell inwards. Mr. Utterson and Poole peered inside. The room lay quietly in the lamplight. A good fire burned in the grate, and a kettle sang its thin strain on the hob. Things were set out for tea near the fire. Edward Hyde lay on the floor. He was dressed in clothes far too big for him. Clothes like Henry Jekyll's. As they gazed down at him, a final spasm crossed his face. He was dead. A crushed phial in his hand told them he had taken poison. There was no sign of Dr. Jekyll.
What has happened to my master?
Cried Poole.
Where is he?
Mr. Utterson shook his head slowly. He had no answer. An envelope lay on Dr. Jekyll's desk. It was addressed to Mr. Utterson. With a heavy heart he opened it, and a letter fell out. The lawyer caught it up. It was written in Dr. Jekyll's handwriting and dated at the top.
Oh, Poole,
Mr. Utterson cried out.
Jekyll wrote this himself. He was here and alive today.
He read the letter.
My dear Utterson, when you read this, I shall have disappeared. My confession is enclosed with this letter. Before you read it, first read the letter Lanyon warned me he had left for you. Your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. Is there something else in that envelope?
Mr. Utterson asked.
Yes, sir.
Poole handed him a packet, heavily sealed in several places. Mr. Utterson put it in his pocket.
Say nothing for the moment, Poole,
he said.
If your master is dead or has run away, we may still save his good name. I'm going home to read these letters in quiet. I will come back as soon as I can, and we will send for the police.
Mr. Utterson trudged home through the lamplit streets, head bowed. He hoped Dr. Lanyon's letter and Henry Jekyll's confession would explain all that had happened. Back in his own study, Mr. Utterson opened the safe and took out Dr. Lanyon's letter. Breaking the seals, he sat down to read it. 4 days ago, Lanyon's letter said, I received a strange note from Dr. Jekyll. It asked me, as a matter of life or death, to do 2 things for him. First, I was to go at once to his study, to take a certain drawer with all its contents from his desk and carry it safely to my home in Cavendish Square. Second, I was to give the drawer to a man who would call in secret at midnight. I thought he had gone mad, but for friendship's sake I did what he asked. I found the drawer and took it home in a cab. Sure enough, on the stroke of midnight, a small man arrived. His clothes were rich and well-tailored, but far too large for him. The trousers were rolled up to keep them from the ground, and the jacket hung loosely across his shoulders. This would have been laughable in an ordinary person. I did not laugh at him, for something in his face aroused both fear and distaste in me. I took him to my study and gave him the drawer. He sprang at the drawer with a sob of relief. Lanyon's letter went on. I could hear his teeth grate as he clenched his jaws in excitement. I felt a chill beginning to creep through my blood. From the drawer, he took packets of powder and a flask of blood-red liquid. Carefully, he mixed some of the powders with the liquid. It boiled, and fumes came from the flask. The liquid turned purple, then green, then yellow. My visitor took up the flask and turned to me. Giving a dreadful smile, he snarled, You hold such narrow scientific views, Lanyon. You've laughed at those who know more than you do. Now, watch. He put the flask to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He staggered, clutched at the table, and gasped for breath. As I watched, his face turned black and seemed to swell. The features melted and changed. Next moment, I sprang from my chair, my arm raised to shield me from this evil. Before my very eyes, pale and shaking like a man snatched from death, stood Henry Jekyll. I cannot put to paper what he told me then. My soul is sickened, my life shaken to its roots. The creature who crept into my home, then changed before my eyes into Henry Jekyll, was none other than Edward Hyde, hunted throughout the land as the murderer of Carew. Hasty Lanyon.
I can't believe it,
exclaimed Mr. Utterson. His face white with shock, he put down Lanyon's letter. Taking out the packet he had brought from Dr. Jekyll's study, he opened it. The letter inside was long and signed by Henry Jekyll. It told a strange, frightening story.
I was born rich,
Henry Jekyll's story began.
I worked hard, however, and had an honourable and distinguished future ahead of me. I so valued the respect of others that I led what could be called a double life. On one side, the serious, upright Henry Jekyll, known and respected throughout London. On the other, the private man who kept his pleasures secret, for fear others would frown on them. In truth, I was ashamed of them. As I grew older, I realized that my nature was divided between good and ill even more deeply than other men's. Through my way of life and my scientific studies, I drew towards a conclusion. Man is not truly one, but truly two. I recognized that neither side of my own character was rightly me. I was both. I dreamed of separating the two. If each side of me could have its own identity, how much easier life would be. The unjust could go on his way, the upright on his, and one would not interfere with the other. Could these two natures be separated? My work in the laboratory led to the discovery of a potion I thought would produce a second form of myself. I hesitated before I tried it. I knew I risked death, for it might destroy the very body I was trying to change. My curiosity was too great, and overcame my alarm. Late one night,
Henry Jekyll's letter continued,
I mixed the potion. I watched it boil and smoke in the flask. Once it had settled, I drank. The most racking pain followed, a grinding of the bones and horror of the spirit. The agony quickly faded, and I came to myself feeling lighter, happier in body, younger. At once I knew I was wicked, but the feeling delighted me. I looked in the mirror and saw Edward Hyde for the first time. He was smaller and younger than Henry Jekyll. Good shone in Jekyll's face, but evil was written plainly on Hyde's. All human beings are a mixture of good and evil. Edward Hyde, alone amongst men, was pure evil. Yet I did not feel strange as I gazed at the face in the mirror. This too was me. The second part of the experiment came next. Could I change back? I drank the potion again. More agony followed, but I came to myself as Henry Jekyll. That night I reached a crossroads. I could stop or go on with the experiment. Excited, I chose to go on. I now had two characters and two appearances. I took the house in Soho and arranged my will in case I should by some ill luck be left in the body of Edward Hyde. The good in me slept. I only had to drink the potion to shake off the body of the noted professor and take on like a cloak that of Edward Hyde. The wickedness in me went out as Edward Hyde to enjoy an evil life. My safety was complete. I could do as I wished. Think of it, Edward Hyde did not even exist. Henry Jekyll was sometimes horrified at what Hyde did, and often tried to make amends for his deeds, but his conscience was stilled. After all, Hyde and Hyde alone was guilty, not Henry Jekyll. Then things went wrong. I began to lose control over the changes. I would go to bed as Henry Jekyll. In the morning I would waken to see the hairy hand of Edward Hyde on the covers and realize I had changed overnight. The evil Edward Hyde was growing stronger than the good Henry Jekyll. I was slowly losing hold of my better self and becoming my worst. I decided I preferred to be the good doctor. For 2 months, I did not take the potion at all. Then, one day, I was tempted and tried it again. My devil had been caged too long and came out roaring. That night, I killed Sir Danvers Carew in a mad rage, just because he spoke to me. I came to myself through a mist and saw that if I were caught, my own life might be in danger. I hurried to the Soho house, and to be safe, destroyed all my papers. Next day came the shattering news that Edward Hyde had been seen killing Carew. He was now being hunted all over London. The body of Henry Jekyll meant safety. If I let Edward Hyde peep out, even for an instant, he could go to the gallows as a murderer. I tried to forget him and live a good life, but the evil in me growled to be free. One afternoon, Henry Jekyll suddenly changed to Edward Hyde in the middle of a London park. Panic struck me. I could not go home for the potion as Hyde. My own servants would have sent for the police. Instead, I hid in a small hotel where no one knew me. I sent a note to Lanyon, asking him to get my drugs for me. Lanyon saw me change from Hyde to Jekyll. His horror upset me. I was no longer afraid of the gallows. It was the fear of becoming Edward Hyde that racked me. I listened to Lanyon's anger in a dream and went home to bed exhausted.
Mr. Utterson turned the page. He read on, full of pity for the haunted man.
Next morning I woke as Henry Jekyll, but within minutes became Edward Hyde. It took a double dose of the potion to change me back. From that day I have been afraid to go to sleep. I have always wakened as Edward Hyde, whose soul boils with rage and hatred. As Hyde's power has become the stronger, the good in Henry Jekyll has weakened and been overcome. Now the worst has happened. I'm cut off from my own face and body and my own nature. You see, the salt I used in the potion has run out. Poole will tell you I sent him all over London for more. Each time he brought a fresh supply, I mixed the potion, but it would not work. I now think that my first supply of salt was impure. That very impurity must have given the potion its power. I'm writing this under the influence of the last of the old salt. Shortly I will change for the last time to Edward Hyde. Henry Jekyll will never be seen again, and I can do nothing about it. Even the evil Edward Hyde knows that doom is closing in on us both. Often he sits and weeps in despair. What will Edward Hyde do now? Will he be caught and go to the gallows for the murder of Sir Danvers Carew? Or will he decide to leave this life on his own? I do not know. Here then I lay down my pen. The life of the unhappy Henry Jekyll is at an end.